Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. Hope you had a great weekend and certainly have a lot to cover this week. Might just mention that in the next hour we'll have Robert Knight with us, author of a couple of new booklets that are available, as well as some commentaries that we have posted on the website. And then even in the third hour we'll have Mary DeMuth in studio. We're going to be talking about sexual abuse and culpability, the unwillingness of some in the past who have reported that. And that's a story we've been following for some time in terms of the Me Too movement. But let's, if we can, talk about a couple of stories that are in the news and then get into some things that relate to even those of you listening in the local situation. We have, of course, a war of words with Iran. No surprise there, I guess. And then also the release of a highly redacted version of the FISA application. A lot of people are talking about that, so we'll get into that briefly. And then also talk about not only the removal of these statues and other monuments, but now calling for not only the removal of those, which we've seen sometimes in the Dallas area and other places around the world and around the country, but now the erection of other statues in their place. I knew this was coming. I just knew this was. So we're going to get into that as well. So lots to cover. But let me cover the story that has to do with a Donald Trump tweet. How many times do we end up talking about those? But anyway, White House on Monday blamed the Iranian president Hassan Rouhani for inciting a war of words. You might be familiar with the fact that on a pretty regular basis, the leader of Iran will oftentimes call death to America, complain about something that the United States has done, call for death to the infidels, and the typical reaction from both President George W. Bush and the reaction from Barack Obama. Both of those presidents have just sort of, paid about as much attention as some of us do when we have an individual on a street corner that you think is maybe mentally disturbed and saying some outrageous things. You just tend to walk by them and just go on about your business. And that has been the way in which we have oftentimes dealt with some of the extreme radical statements that have been coming from various leaders, either the Ayatollahs or various presidents in Iran. And so he earlier in that particular tweet backfire actually had Rouhani was saying, America must understand well that peace with Iran is the mother of all peace and war with Iran is the mother of all wars. Not half as controversial sometimes as some of the other things that Hassan Rouhani has said, but that was enough for our president to actually send out a tweet. And it's called the all caps tweet because what it says is, and you know what you mean when you put all caps, it's like you're shouting it. So in this particular case, Donald Trump tweeted, never, ever threaten the United States again, or you will suffer consequences the like of which few throughout history have ever suffered before. Here we go again. Now, again, if this sounds familiar, it's like, yeah, sounds very familiar to the back and forth between our president and the leader of North Korea. And, of course, a lot of people had said that history of firing off tweets like that would escalate into some kind of dispute. So far, of course, what it has done is developed into at least an opportunity to get together, have a high-profile summit, and it talks about denuclearization. I think we, again, have to be fairly skeptical about whether or not that's going to bring about anything. But the fact that you had North Korea sitting down with the president on June 12th, maybe that's the case. Of course, immediately there have been all sorts of people saying, well, did he clear this with his various security analysts? I think the answer probably to that is no, but nevertheless, there was a question asked of Donald Trump's national security advisor, John Bolton, and he actually had said that the President Trump told me that if Iran does anything at all to the negative, they will pay a price like countries have ever paid before, like few countries have ever paid before. So, nevertheless, that's the Trump tweet that is out there in all caps. Of course, it is reverberated all through the Middle East, but there have been some that have actually praised it. Let me just give you one example. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu praised the president's strong stance after years in which the Iranian regime was pampered, he said, by world powers, a direct quote. So, nevertheless, we'll see how that one develops, but that's the one that you might be hearing about today, the so-called tweet in all caps. Now, over the weekend, we have had something rather remarkable. Over time, there have been a number of talk shows that have spent a lot of time talking about the FISA application, the FISA warrants, the investigation of Donald Trump. We do this from time to time, but I don't want to wear you out, especially since there are so many other things to talk about. But Andrew McCarthy, who's been on the program with us before, and is an individual who's now a senior fellow with the National Review Institute, and an individual who's probably best known for bringing a prosecution against those involved in the first attempted bombing of the World Trade Center. Nevertheless, his piece that came out in National Review, FISA applications confirm the FBI relied on the unverified Steele dossier. And he said, it's crystal clear, at least is his conclusion, that the Steele dossier, this is the one that talked about the Russian hookers and Donald Trump and all sorts of things, which, as far as we can tell, was completely made up. But nevertheless, this dossier was an unverified Clinton campaign product and was the driving force behind the Trump-Russia investigation. He says, based on the dossier, the FBI told the FISA court that it believed that Carter Page, who had been identified by the Trump campaign as an advisor, was coordinating with the Russian government in an espionage conspiracy to influence the 2016 election. And this sensational allegation, Andrew McCarthy says, came from Christopher Steele, the former British spy, and the FISA court was not told that the Clinton campaign was behind Steele's work, nor did the FBI and the Justice Department inform the court that Steele's allegations had never been verified. To the contrary, each FISA application, the original one in October 2016, and the 3 renewals at 90-day intervals are all labeled verified application in bold caps. And so you can go through his piece, which goes on for 10 pages, and I'm not going to read through all of it, but nevertheless kind of helps you understand some of the idiosyncrasies there and some of the procedures necessary to actually get that kind of investigation. When we come back, I do want to read a piece from Thomas Gallatin that I think does a good job of kind of summarizing this. So often when we hear this, there's a tendency for the eyes to glaze over, and there's a couple of reasons. First of all, it involves a little bit of understanding the FISA court, understanding some of the intricacies of the bureaucracy. I think for anybody that's been listening to talk radio any length of time, we don't talk about as much here as other talk shows do. This is probably like old news. It's kind of like, well, we sort of knew this years ago, certainly months ago, depending on when it finally occurred to you that all of this was based upon a false dossier. And you can talk about Fusion GPS and Christopher Steele and go through all of that. But the other part of it is that sometimes we just want to move on with our lives, and so we don't spend a whole lot of time here talking about it. But when we come back, I'm going to give you a couple of points, maybe 5 points real quickly to talk about why this is significant. And if nothing else, just an illustration again of how everybody looking at evidence looks at it in a different way. Because some on the left say, this just validates everything we're doing. Those on the right say, this just shows it was all a sham in the first place. We'll come back and talk about its significance right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
There's been lots of fear-mongering from the left about how the newly constituted Supreme Court would rule on various social issues. Justices that attempt to apply the original intent of the Constitution to legal issues are called originalist. Here are a few suggestions about how an originalist court might rule on cases before it. Abortion. Despite the fears being spread that the next court would overturn Roe v. Wade, there isn't any likelihood that it would happen soon. First, there has to be a significant case that would come before the court. Then there would have to be at least 5 justices willing to use the case to overturn the 1973 abortion decision that has been a precedent for over 4 decades. Religious liberty. The narrow decision in the Masterpiece Cake Shop case suggests that future religious liberty cases will be decided in favor of the First Amendment, even when it appears to conflict with LGBT issues. In fact, the Kennedy opinion in the case suggests that further confirmation of religious liberty will come when future cases come before the court. Gun laws. An originalist court would probably provide clearer definition for the Second Amendment rights of citizens. The court has already ruled in 2 cases about the right to own weapons that are in common use for lawful purposes. And affirmative action. An originalist court would probably be a colorblind court. The original meaning of equal protection in the Constitution would suggest that attempts to favor one race over another would be unconstitutional. These few examples conform to what most Americans would desire from the Supreme Court. In fact, they match up closely to various opinion polls taken over the last few decades. An originalist court would not be as controversial as many liberals say that it would be. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
A few more minutes. I want to focus a little bit of time on the FISA application, try to put that in some kind of perspective. And again, this piece by Thomas Gallatin, probably a good way to summarize that because, again, there's so many other issues we want to get into in just a minute. One of those I thought would be interesting is to see how the activists not only want to tear down various statues and monuments, but they want to put up other ones. First of all, it's kind of getting harder and harder to justify tearing down some of these statues and monuments. In Dallas, for example, at a time when there's not enough in the budget to hire more police officers, to spend money to tear down statues or monuments that are offensive to a few individuals is difficult to justify. It would be even more difficult to then justify putting them up. But I do want to read from at least one campus which is doing its best to not only tear down offensive monuments, one of which is a statue of Thomas Jefferson. After all, the old slaves, that's enough, right? And then who are they going to put up? Che Guevara, something like that. Anyway, we'll get to that in just a minute. But let's get back to this issue. Thomas Gallatin puts it this way. Over the weekend, the Justice Department finally released a 412-page, highly redacted version of the FBI's application for the FISA warrant, and that stands for the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. This is a special kind of court. And by the way, this thing is so redacted, I've heard some people say, wouldn't you like to have the concession for Sharpies or black or other kinds of ink, because it just, there's so much that's blacked out that even though it's there in black and white, there's a lot more black sometimes than there is white. But anyway, I digress. So the warrant granted, as we pointed out, back in October 2016 before the final election, gave the FBI authorization to wiretap then presidential candidate Donald Trump's foreign policy advisor Carter Page as part of its Russian investigation. Now, I hope you understand that when you wiretap Carter Page, then any individual that is talking to Carter Page, we have their information. And then, of course, we talked about on Friday with Kelly Shackelford, you could also unmask who those individuals are. And so it's a good way to sort of come in the back door to begin to find out what's taking place. Anyway, back in February of this year, both the House Intelligence Committee and the Senate Judiciary Committee released their findings on the FBI handling of the FISA application, and in both cases concluded that the FBI had misled the court over the legitimacy of this dossier, which was provided by the spy Christopher Steele. Furthermore, the FBI relied almost exclusively upon the dossier as justification for seeking the FISA warrant, as well as for 3 subsequent extensions of the original warrant. Now, you've got to go back and say, is it possible that some of the individuals who have also testified about the fact that the dossier was only incidental or one of many reasons, is it possible that they just did not understand that? James Comey, for example, remember in one of the interviews, he said, the dossier wasn't that important. Now, when you look at the application, you realize it was the reason. It wasn't just incidental. It wasn't insignificant. It was the reason. And so that's certainly another aspect and fallout in this. But we'll get to that in just a minute. Thomas Gallatin goes on to say, this latest document release serves to confirm what Republicans, and in particular, specifically, Representative Devin Nunes from California, have long been arguing that leadership within Barack Obama's Justice Department abused its authority in order to justify spying on a political opponent. None of this is new news since the House and Senate released their memos earlier this year, but now we have the actual FISA application, and those details are an opportunity for people to read them as well. So, what new details have come to light? And he's got a couple of conclusions, and if you're taking some notes, you might want to write them down. First, there's no question, he says, that the Department of Justice and the FBI relied on unverified Steele dossier in obtaining the FISA warrant. I think we've already sort of said that. Second, it now appears that not only did Hillary Clinton's campaign and the DNC, which would be the Democratic National Committee, pay Steele to compile the dossier, but that source number 1, which is in the FISA application, in case you'd like to read it for yourself, 412 pages, you're welcome to do so, that source number 1 would be Steele, has been compensated by the FBI. How much and for what specific service has been redacted, so we don't know how much he was paid and what those services were, but now we know, first of all, that indeed the dossier provided by Christopher Steele was important. Number 2, we recognize that he was compensated. He might have been compensated by the Hillary campaign and the Democratic National Committee, but it looks like he was also compensated by the FBI. Nice work if you can get it. Number 3, it is confirmed that the FBI relied heavily on hearsay and Steele's reputation and did not establish the reliability of his subsources. Another very important point, because some people said, well, sometimes individuals submit documents. Turns out later they're not as reliable as we might think, but you would expect that especially if you're going to spy on, and again, a lot of people say, no, it's not spying. We're just eavesdropping on them. We're surveilling them. Okay, we can quibble about that. I've seen individuals say, that's not spying when you're surveilling individuals. Well, I don't know what you call it, but I remember when I was a kid, if I was listening in on somebody, I was spying on them, right? But nevertheless, some people will say it's different. But nevertheless, we can at least say that nobody was checking out the reliability of those sources. And then number 4, the Department of Justice used multiple news stories that had in turn sourced their reporting from Steele himself in seeking further evidence to support his warrant application. If you're not familiar, in order to make it look like this was a bigger deal, Christopher Steele and others actually had some news stories out there about the dossier. So then when you present it, you have the dossier and then you have some news stories, so it made it look bigger than it really was, obviously. But they were all basically a circular connection there as well. And 5th, No probable cause is established in the FISA application. While a theory is proposed, no supporting evidence is offered in supporting the theory. The application states that the FBI believes that the Russian government's interference efforts are being coordinated with Page, that would be Carter Page, and perhaps other individuals associated with Trump. That's a direct quote, by the way, from the application, that believes the Russian government's interference efforts are being coordinated with Page and perhaps other individuals associated with Trump. And so that's the allegation, but there's no proof of it. And the only justification for it is a dossier and a couple of other articles that were leaked to the press to make it look more important than it really was. Finally, I've already given you the 5 points, but there's kind of a nice conclusion, and that is if you also look at the implications of this, you go to an individual by the name of Margot Cleveland at the Federalist, who says, quote, the Department of Justice effectively criminalized Republican foreign policy by using leaked information from the internal Republican platform debates as evidence of collusion. Cleveland goes on to say, also disconcerting is the Department of Justice's reliance on Trump's so-called conciliatory words towards Russia in conflict with Republican insiders to justify spying on the Trump campaign, in effect criminalizing foreign policy differences concerning Ukraine. So this not only had an impact in terms of the surveillance, and one of the reasons why we've had individuals who in the past probably did not like Donald Trump and are very liberal and progressive, nevertheless calling out their fellow progressives saying, since when did we all of a sudden get all upset? Not get upset, I guess would be a better way to say it, not be upset about the surveillance of an individual only because, well, you don't like the individual. But in the past, we always were upset about what the CIA or the FBI did in surveilling individuals. But anyway, we're back to the piece by Andrew McCarthy in which he says, now we can all see it all in black and white, mostly black, as they are heavily redacted. It is crystal clear that indeed the Steele dossier, an unverified Clinton campaign product, was the driving force behind the Trump-Russian investigation. So we'll leave it there, but if nothing else, just again, something that has come out over the weekend, and if you would like to read it, I don't know that it makes very interesting reading, you have the 412-page, highly redacted version of the application to the FISA court, which stands again for Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And it's just one more illustration of how, in one way or another, this was misleading those individuals that were granting a warrant so that we could indeed surveil individuals. And I remember on Point of View years ago, we warned that creating things like a FISA court could be misused. It was always justified because this is the way that we can actually begin to surveil terrorist and terrorist communication. But here's a good example of where it was used against a presidential candidate and ultimately even against his early days of the administration. Let's take a break, though. We need to cover a lot more issues, and we will do so right after this.
A 2013 survey asked people around the world whether sex without marriage is morally wrong. Every country where more than 90% said, yes, it's morally wrong, Islamic. The worst two, tied at 6% saying it's wrong, France and Germany, the nations of Calvin and Luther. Catholic Italy, 11%. Simply sad. The United States, well, 31%. Not even 1 in 3 thinks extramarital sex is morally wrong. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let me just mention, next hour we're going to spend some time talking about online mobbing. That's one of the articles that we've posted on the website. Also, the real challenge right now in the Democratic Party about whether or not it wants to go further left or try to appeal people by becoming more moderate. And there is a piece that has come out from the Miami Herald that's really begun to say, you know, there is a real problem because some of the centrist Democrats are really starting to argue with what they call the far left agenda, since the pictures there are of an individual by the name of actually kind of the new leader, if you will, in the Democratic Party, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and then also they show Bernie Sanders. That really, in a sense, you could say the headline is centrist Democrats begin arguing against the socialist in the party. But nevertheless, we'll get to that in the next hour. But I thought since we broadcast here in Dallas, and that has been a real controversy about these statues, I would show you what's kind of happening on some of the college campuses and what I think is coming perhaps soon here to the state of Texas and in particular to the city of Dallas. And this is a piece by George Leaf. It is interesting because it's called The Furor Over Statues and Monuments. And the picture is interesting because it's a picture from a university, Duke University in particular, where you can see at one time there was a statue of Robert E. Lee, which has been ripped out. And now there's just this obvious gap. Well, next to Robert E. Lee is a statue of Thomas Jefferson. And now there is a call to rip him out of that alcove, which is then going to look even more unbalanced because on the other side is a statue of the poet Sidney Lanier. And so it's almost like taking one out looks bad enough. Taking two out would make the third look worse. But then, again, you may not be familiar with Sidney Lanier. He's a poet, probably best known during the 19th century for having produced these books for young boys about knighthood and chivalry and things like that. But, again, guess what? He served, I think, just as a private in the Confederate Army. So it's only a matter of time before they'll rip him off his pedestal, too. And then you're going to have just 3 blank spots as you walk into Duke University's chapel. And I think just to help you understand what I think might be coming to Dallas, and, of course, our listeners up in Minneapolis, probably the same place there, George Leaf says, for the last few years, lots of leftist energy has been directed at objects made of stone or metal, statues and monuments depicting people they don't like. They think, or want the rest of us to think, that the world will be improved by tearing down such objects and replacing them with new objects to represent diversity. Somehow that's supposed to make supposedly oppressed people feel better. Naturally, this is most evident on campuses of prestigious universities where social justice warrior students gravitate and where spineless leftist administrators can't tell them, grow up and mind your studies. So, nevertheless, that's one of his commentaries, but then goes into an article that was written by Shannon Watkins, who writes about the battle over statues and monuments, focusing in particular on the campus we're talking about here. Student activists there have a plan for getting rid of the representations of people who displease them and replacing them with new ones of people who will make the campus more diverse. Now, here's the direct quote, and I think it helps you understand that even if you tear down some of the monuments and you tear down some of the statues, that's not going to be enough. And the illustration that comes from this particular article by Shannon Watkins says that merely removing statues they deem to be offensive is not enough for these activists. Instead, they are demanding that campuses be remade according to their radical vision. This includes calling for the installation of new monuments and memorials to be erected that are more in line with the updated values they insist universities embrace. And so, of course, what you see right now is they've already, let's use Duke University as an example, since that's a picture that's in front of us there, removed the statue of Robert E. Lee in the center. Now, of course, as it says, Thomas Jefferson, for instance, has to go. He owned slaves, as we all know, and therefore, according to the activists, Duke chose to have a Jefferson statue as part of its plan to support white supremacy. No, that's not why he's there. Maybe, I don't know, maybe author of the Declaration of Independence, third president, founder of the University of Virginia Declaration of Rights. No. It's all about white supremacy and maintaining it as part of the ongoing conspiracy to keep people of color down, so it's got to go. Watkins then says students should feel part of the university community because they seek to be scholars, thinkers, experimenters, writers, and rational beings capable of producing knowledge, not because they see their particular race or gender depicted in front of a manicured lawn. True, but these social justice warriors aren't really much interested in education. They're interested in doing anything that helps advance their particular vision of the world. So if nothing else, that is just a preview of coming attractions. We're seeing now more and more arguments being made that it is not enough to actually tear down the statues. In this case, Robert E. Lee is gone. Thomas Jefferson's going soon. And I'm pretty sure that Sidney Lanier, the poet, is going because, after all, he actually was part of the Confederate Army. Not sure they ever even shot at anybody, but nevertheless was a private. And that's reason enough to tear him down as well. And after that, if you think it's over, it's just begun, because then they want to put up other statues and spend more money to erect those. So if you got some comments about that, love to hear your comments. 1-800-351-1212. Let me also just real quickly announce something that probably will not get to maybe again until Friday, and maybe not even then. And that is each year there is a organization called Citizens Against Government Waste. And they always, over these years, have actually highlighted pork barrel spending. And so now it's become known as the Pig Book. And I saw a picture the other day of Ted Cruz, Senator Ted Cruz, standing next to a pink pig. And I go, what is that all about? And then I read the caption and found out that he was there when the Congressional Pig Book was released by Citizens Against Government Waste. And so it has released that, and I guess maybe I'll do a commentary on it because it's just, again, your tax dollars at work. And in the interest of time, let me just use three. We're coming up to a break here real quickly, but here's a couple of them. And I appreciate the fact that they go after everyone. You know, sometimes when they talk about any kind of pork barrel spending, they'll only focus on some investigation of some kind of fly or snake or something like that. I mean, the first one on their list is, interesting enough, the spending of $2.7 billion for the Joint Strike Fighter program to add 20 F-35 fighter jets. Oftentimes what in the past was almost untouchable was defense spending, although we did hear about these very expensive hammers, but most of the time we didn't hear that. But again, the Pig Book talks about the fact that the program, in place for 17 years and 7 years behind schedule, so far has cost more than $406 billion, close to double its initial estimate of $233 billion. So this is a good example of putting more bad money after good, and just more money after bad money situation, where an additional $2.7 billion to a tab that's already run up $406 billion, which has been in place for 17 years and is 7 years behind schedule. So there's a good example. A couple more real quickly. $65 million for the Pacific Coastal Salmon Recovery Fund within the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which the White House found was not optimally targeted and favored certain species and geographic areas over others. And then while we're talking about this, how about $13 million to the National Park Service's Save America's Treasures grant program, created to preserve historic landmarks, art, and publication, even, and I underscore even, under the Obama administration, they called for the elimination of that particular program. And let's face it, there were a lot of people in the Obama administration never saw a government program they didn't like. So this was one they wanted to get rid of. This is one that Trump wants to get rid of. And maybe the Pig Book will get rid of a few more of these areas of governmental waste. Getting rid of all of them still won't balance the budget, but again, why should we spend bad investments for bad programs that are ineffective programs that in some cases only survive because they're pork barrel projects that help particular members of Congress? So again, I applaud the Pig Book for 2018. It comes from the Citizens Against Government Waste. And if in your news feed, maybe on Facebook or something, you see a picture of Ted Cruz standing next to a pink pig, that's what it's all about. It's not that he's a pig. It's not that he's supporting pork barrel. Just the opposite. He supports the fact that the 2018 Congressional Pig Book identifies some areas of government waste that we need to get rid of. We'll be back right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Whether it's Tim Tebow, Coach Joe Kennedy, or the thousands of players taking a knee together in prayer after a game, prayer seems to be a popular theme around football. At Wrights High School in Evansville, Indiana, the players value prayer rather highly, it would seem. That became controversial only when a picture of the players gathered in prayer landed on the front page of the local newspaper. Activists sent the school district an angry letter threatening a lawsuit should the school officials refuse to take action. According to them, the coach was violating the law because the picture showed him surrounded by his football players and everyone appeared to be praying. But let's break down that picture a little closer. Yes, the coach was in the center, surrounded by his players, but it clearly shows the players with bowed heads and hands laid on the coach, led by one player whose lips are forming the prayers. The players were praying for their coach. Activists would have this coach stop up his ears and run screaming from the scene of this religious activity, but common sense and the Constitution would call this hostility to the free exercise of religion by the players. Students have a First Amendment right to pray for their coach, and the school cannot legally stop their religious expression. Thankfully, that's precisely what school officials told the activists. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Students and teachers are being told that prayer, Bibles, and religion are illegal in public school, but that's not true. Learn the facts. Read your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org right now. Don't let anyone steal your freedom with bad information. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
For a few more minutes, we're going to get into some more of these issues in the next hour. But one of the things that we have posted is a piece that came out, interesting enough, in the Miami Herald, although it's based upon some things that were happening in Ohio. And the headline says, centrist Dems begin arguing against far-left agenda as the 2020 play out. And so one of the issues that is beginning to surface is that the Democratic Party in 2018 is not your father's Democratic Party. I've said this more than once, but I think you're starting to see all sorts of stories surfacing, because if you look at those individuals, for example, who believe that they're going to be the next Democratic candidate for the presidency, the so-called Dem 5, most of them have taken very radical stands, and I'll certainly make a case for that in just a minute. But it is, I think, illustrated by the fact that this particular article talks about the so-called third way. Now, what's the third way? Well, that was something that was proposed by some of the more moderate Democrats, Bill Clinton being a good example of that, but there are others as well. And the third way approach is being completely shouted down. Matter of fact, if you go out on YouTube, you can see right now some places where there was a candidate forum in particular where they ask, do any of you candidates support ICE, that's Immigration and Customs Enforcement, because most of you want to abolish it. This one candidate raises her hand and she gets booed down. And then when they ask a couple of other questions, again, anytime she would raise her hand on issues that are not all that controversial. Now, matter of fact, wouldn't even have been controversial a year ago. Now you can just see that there is such a move to the left that a lot of people have said, would a Bill Clinton even be nominated in the Democratic Party? I think it's clear to say that a John F. Kennedy would not be nominated in this party. And part of it has to do with the fact that some of the leadership is changing. If you were to go out right now and ask some Democrats that happen to be in this building or along the street who they would say are the leaders of the Democratic Party, you would certainly get answers like, well, I think Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer in the Senate, and maybe House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi. But if you go out to some of these rallies, they will tell you that their leader is either somebody like Bernie Sanders or, more importantly, this 28-year-old by the name of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Now, you might say, who is she again? Well, she's the one that just won a primary in the Bronx. This was Congressional District 14 in New York. It's the 14th Congressional District in the state of New York. And she was able to unseat kind of the third-ranking Democrat in the House of Representatives. And she's a self-proclaimed socialist. I'm not giving her that title. She gives it to herself. And, of course, if you go to her website, which I have done, you will see that that's exactly what she is claiming. And so this particular article has her on the front article. Then you turn over one more. You have a picture of her and Bernie Sanders. And so, again, you've got more and more of those individuals that are inviting individual. By the way, she's only been elected in the primary. It's pretty much of a foregone conclusion that she'll probably be in the Congress now because any Republican running against her probably will lose, but you never know. But it will be interesting to see. So there are lots of times having her or Bernie Sanders or both show up at one of these rallies. And so she's kind of become this darling of political progressives and has attracted, of course, a lot of media attention. But the sad reality is, and we'll get into this a little bit more in the next hour, it is not really helpful to her because it is really all this media attention is starting to show how little political experience she has and how much she doesn't know about history and about politics and economics. You might say, well, that's unfair. She's 28 years of age. Okay, but she ran, as Congress, You might say, well, what were you doing at 28 years of age? Actually, I went back to graduate school for a second graduate degree at Georgetown so I could learn more about government, so I wouldn't say some of the kinds of things that are being said right now. So this may be a classic illustration of laying on hands on an individual who, to put it quite mildly, is not ready for prime time. You might say, well, what evidence do you have of that? Well, she was on the PBS program Firing Line. You might remember that was one that was started by William F. Buckley. Now, was it Margaret Hoover is the host there? And, again, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was giving all sorts of comments about politics and capitalism and education. But the clip that most people have been watching is one where she referred to Israel's occupation of Palestine. And when Margaret Hoover then asked her for some clarification of what she said, well, then you see some of the most cringe-worthy comments on a broadcast that you probably have ever seen, in which she finally ended with an admission that she's not the expert on geopolitics or the issue. And then when it comes to the economy, she's got a great theory. That is, the reason unemployment is so low is because everyone has two jobs. Now, to be fair, she's not the only one saying that. Elizabeth Warren the other day was saying the reason the economy is doing so well is some people are working 2, 3, 4 jobs just trying to make ends meet. That is so inaccurate as to have caused the left-leaning PolitiFact to not only rate the claim as false, but pants on fire false, just off the charts, and you can go to PolitiFact right now and see some of the other claims are kind of like, well, that's not quite right. I mean, they just go off the deep end on that one. And of course, if you want to understand a little bit more about where she is, where Bernie Sanders is, and now where virtually all of the so-called Democratic Five are, they all, and I'm just reading from her website now, she calls for free college for everyone, federal jobs guarantee, so that means that everybody gets a job, and if the economy can't provide it, then the federal government's going to provide it, single-payer health care, although she calls it Medicare for all, but if you really want to understand that, it becomes kind of VA for all very quickly, housing as a human right, and, of course, the mobilization against climate change. She's, of course, for complete gun control and abolishing ICE, which I just mentioned a minute ago, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And if that's the new leader and kind of the public face of the Democratic Party, I suspect many of you that are listening are Democrats are going to say, what happened to my party and where did it go? And am I really being well served by some of the leadership? But that, I think, shows you, if nothing else, kind of a real desire to sort of, dumb down and double down and begin to focus on platitudes, slogans, and very controversial issues, not the least of which is, wouldn't you like to at least ask a question? Where is this money coming from? Because when we went through this with Bernie Sanders just on the issue of free college, and we ran the numbers, it was all based upon the assumption that I'm going to rather dramatically increase the tax rate on millionaires and billionaires. But when you increase the taxes on them, they don't just sit there and say, okay, I guess I'll just have to pay some more. What do? They invest in other things, or they don't actually invest at all. Or they don't build businesses, or they don't build buildings, they don't establish other kinds of things that would actually be job creation. They actually just sit on their money and simply don't bother to involve themselves in the economy when the tax rate is too high. So the assumption that by raising the tax rates we'll have enough money for everything from a federal jobs guarantee to free college is based on a false assumption. And we've been down that argument before, and if you'd like to see some of the facts and figures, some of my commentaries on our Viewpoints commentaries cover that pretty well. When we come back, though, we've got a lot more to cover. I haven't even talked about the whole mobbing of any liberal that says something nice about a conservative. That piece came out by David French, The Sliming of Ben Shapiro. We'll get into that. We'll talk a little bit more about this far-left agenda. And then we'll be talking with our good friend Robert Knight about some of his newest booklets and articles. And then in the third hour, we'll have Mary DeMuth talk about the Me Too movement and the concern about sexual abuse and the whole issue of culpability. All that coming up right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. Hope you had a great weekend, and we're going to certainly hit a lot of important issues in the next couple of hours. Might just mention that later this hour we have Robert Knight with us. He has written a book called The Strong Constitution: What Would America Look Like If We Followed the Law? Also an earlier one on confronting lies and hate. And, of course, we've posted some of his particular articles. One that came out today on the predictability of Barack Obama, which we haven't posted, but also living in revolutionary times and tired of winning yet. So I've got a lot of things to cover with him in just a few minutes. And then Mary DeMuth will be in studio with us in the next hour. We'll be talking about sexual abuse and culpability, and in particular focusing on some material that has come out in the film about Joe Paterno. So we'll get into that, and of course, as always, give you a chance to join the conversation at any point you'd like to join us. 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to post an article or post a comment, you can also go to our postings that we have. Of course, we have a YouTube opportunity for you to join with us, but also Facebook. We're on Facebook Live, and there's a place for you to leave some comments as well. But before we talk with Robert Knight in the latter part of this hour, I wanted to get into a couple of issues. One, big story right now about what's called the war of words, or the war of capitalized words. And this has to do with a back and forth between the president, or the leader, I guess would be a better way to say it, of Iran, Hassan Rouhani, and President Donald Trump. Rouhani the other day, is so typical in Iran, spent some time calling for the destruction of the United States. You know, it's the great Satan and death to America and all the rest. One of the comments that came out was kind of a challenge, which Donald Trump decided to respond to. What he said was, that is, Rouhani, America must understand well that peace with Iran is the mother of all peace, and war with Iran is the mother of all wars. Now, the reaction generally to the kind of outrageous and hyperbolic statements that you get from the Iranian presidents has been to just ignore them. If you've ever been in a city where you have somebody on a street corner and they're just talking to themselves, or they're shouting, and you know that they might be mentally disturbed, you sort of just walk by them. You don't give them eye contact, just keep walking by them. And that has been kind of the response from President George W. Bush and President Barack Obama. And in some cases, it's been the reaction sometimes of President Donald Trump, but not willing to always let that go. He came out with a tweet, which is in all capitals. You know, when you see something on Facebook or email, it's all capitals, it's like you're shouting. And here's what it said: "Never, ever threaten the United States again, or you will suffer consequences the like of which few throughout history have ever suffered before." That's pretty strong, and it reminded a lot of people of the back and forth between our president and the leader of North Korea. And you might remember that there were those at the time warning that those tweets might escalate into some kind of dispute. They ended up, as you might remember, in something just a little bit different, and that is a summit that took place June 12th. And so whether this results in anything other than just another war of words was kind of interesting, but nevertheless, a good example of the fact that Donald Trump is not willing to let even statements by the Iranian president or leader go without some kind of reaction. And, of course, immediately there are all sorts of people saying, well, were there any individuals in the national security team that were consulted? And Sarah Sanders said, well, the president routinely consults with his national security team. Whether that they approve the tweet, I doubt it. But, again, his national security advisor, John Bolton, had said that the president told me that if Iran does anything at all to the negative, they will pay a price like few countries have ever paid before. So I suspect he knew it was coming, if nothing else. Now, over the weekend, there was the release of the FISA application, and this has been, again, one of those examples where, depending on whether you believe that what the FBI has done was a good thing or a bad thing, depends on how you actually work your way through this particular FISA application. If nothing else, one of the individuals that we have quoted from and interviewed before, Andrew McCarthy, said that it is crystal clear that the Steele dossier, an unverified Clinton campaign product, was the driving force behind the Trump-Russia investigation. Based on the dossier, the FBI told the FISA court that it believed Carter Page, who had been identified by the Trump campaign as an advisor, was coordinating with the Russian government in an espionage conspiracy to influence the 2016 election. And so that piece is out, and if you'd want to read it, it's about 10 pages long. Or, of course, if you want to read the original, we do have a 412-page, highly redacted, that's a nice way of saying there's probably more black than white in some places, of our application that goes to the FISA court. FISA stands for the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And again, depending on where you are on this, you can probably either say this is no big deal or this is evidence of complete mismanagement on the part of the FBI. Thomas Gallatin put it this way. He said this latest document release serves to confirm what Republicans, and specifically Representative Devin Nunes, have long been arguing, and that is that leadership within the Justice Department under Barack Obama abused its authority in order to justify spying on a political opponent. None of this is new news since the House and Senate released their memos earlier this year, but now we have the actual FISA application details in public and can fill in the picture. So he has a couple of comments about this. Number one, his argument is that there is now no question that the Department of Justice and the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, relied on an unverified document by Christopher Steele in obtaining the FISA warrant. Number two, it now appears that not only did Hillary Clinton's campaign, but also the Democratic National Committee, the DNC, paid Christopher Steele to actually compile the dossier. But then it says source number one, which again is Christopher Steele, has been compensated by the FBI, which means he was paid by the Clinton campaign and the DNC, or both, or either, or both. I don't even show which one. And then also by the FBI for this dossier. Then you have, third, it's also confirmed that the FBI relied heavily on hearsay and Steele's reputation and did not even establish the reliability of some of the sources. Fourth, the Department of Justice used multiple news stories that had in turn sourced their reporting from Steele. This is where, in order to make it look more important, some of this was leaked to the press. So then you had stories and you had the dossier, but they all came from the same source. And fifth, no probable cause is established in the FISA application. While a theory is proposed, no supporting evidence is offered. The application says, quote, that it believes that Russian government's interference efforts are being coordinated with Page and perhaps other individuals associated with Trump, but there's no evidence for it as well. So that's the latest very significant revelation that took place over the weekend. Oftentimes these document dumps are done on Friday. This one actually was done on Saturday. And even though it's heavily redacted, I think it just confirms some of the things we've talked about around the table as well. We come back, though, I want to get into a couple of the articles we've posted today. Moderate versus leftist Democrats and online mobbing. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
There's been lots of fear-mongering from the left about how the newly constituted Supreme Court would rule on various social issues. Justices that attempt to apply the original intent of the Constitution to legal issues are called originalist. Here are a few suggestions about how an originalist court might rule on cases before it. Abortion. Despite the fears being spread that the next court would overturn Roe v. Wade, there isn't any likelihood that it would happen soon. First, there has to be a significant case that would come before the court. Then there would have to be at least 5 justices willing to use the case to overturn the 1973 abortion decision that has been a precedent for over 4 decades. Religious liberty. The narrow decision in the Masterpiece Cake Shop case suggests that future religious liberty cases will be decided in favor of the First Amendment, even when it appears to conflict with LGBT issues. In fact, the Kennedy opinion in the case suggests that further confirmation of religious liberty will come when future cases come before the court. Gun laws. An originalist court would probably provide clearer definition for the Second Amendment rights of citizens. The court has already ruled in 2 cases about the right to own weapons that are in common use for lawful purposes. And affirmative action. An originalist court would probably be a colorblind court. The original meaning of equal protection in the Constitution would suggest that attempts to favor one race over another would be unconstitutional. These few examples conform to what most Americans would desire from the Supreme Court. In fact, they match up closely to various opinion polls taken over the last few decades. An originalist court would not be as controversial as many liberals say that it would be. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
One of the articles we posted here today is called Moderate versus Leftist Democrats, and it really is a piece that came out through, interestingly enough, the Miami Herald, although the actual material we're talking about was released in Ohio. So whether you find yourself in Florida or Ohio really doesn't matter, because this has sort of become a national issue, and that is, how far left will the Democratic Party go? Let me give some history. There was a time not so long ago, as certainly by the 1960s and 70s, where there was still just a lot of overlap between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. I mean, you could have fairly conservative Democrats. You could have fairly liberal Republicans. To this day, you still have some liberal Republicans that serve in Congress, for example, especially from the Northeast. And in the past, we've had some fairly conservative Democrats, but there's been an attempt to sort of push them out of the party. And that is best illustrated by this particular article that we've posted. And I'd love to hear from some of you that are Democrats and wonder whether or not this is the Democratic Party that you used to be a part of not so long ago, because there are people that are starting to say, especially this think tank called Third Way. The Third Way was something that was similar to what actually was proposed by candidate and then President Bill Clinton. And some people have said the Democratic Party has now become so liberal and so progressive that it isn't really even the same party that would even nominate a Bill Clinton, certainly would not nominate a John F. Kennedy. And so that's part of the issue that you have to really begin to wonder about in terms of where the leadership of the party is going to go. and how that's going to affect this election, which we've talked about before. If you were to go outside of this building and interview some individuals that are part of the Democratic Party or have been lifelong Democrats, you'd say, well, who's the leader of your party right now? I think you'd get some answers, probably Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi. But you know what you're starting to run into more and more, and that is, no, Bernie Sanders, or what a lot of people are calling the new leader of the Republican Party, which I have to say with a smile on my face, is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Now, you might say, who is she? Well, she's the 28-year-old self-proclaimed socialist. She calls herself a socialist, obviously, who recently won the Democratic primary in the 14th district in New York and actually unseated the third most powerful Democrat in the House of Representatives. She's been kind of this darling of the progressives. And even in this article, the first picture is a picture of her. You turn the page, the next picture is a picture of Bernie Sanders and her. Now, Bernie Sanders calls himself a socialist. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez calls herself a socialist. We're not calling them something that they are not. But what you have is this center-left think tank called Third Way, which kind of represents some of the ideas that used to be held by Bill Clinton and others, as arguing that the party really can, in one way, endorse change, but doesn't have to actually criticize capitalism and say that capitalism needs to end. And so it really unveiled its findings after a year-long kind of assessment and, in a sense, trying to actually convince potential presidential contenders that they don't have to adopt the left, the hard left agenda of Bernie Sanders. And included in the report were dozens of big-picture policy recommendations and things of that nature. And they really even attempted to remove the moderate moniker from the event, because even calling yourself a moderate can sometimes get you in trouble. And even the title here, Centrist Democrats Began Arguing Against the Far Left Agenda. Well, you could also say, in a sense, the centrist Democrats are arguing against at least two socialists, Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And that is, I think, becoming one of the big issues. You know, how radical are we going to begin to see in some of these very important issues? Will these so-called Democratic Five actually be involved in the process? Because these are individuals, for example, Joe Biden, Cory Booker from New Jersey, Kamala Harris from California, Bernie Sanders, of course, from Vermont, and Elizabeth Sanders from Massachusetts, that when you look at the so-called Democratic Five, also pretty much agree on kind of five big issues that we've talked about here before. Single-payer plan, what they sometimes refer to as Medicare for all, although it won't turn out to be Medicare for all very long, because if you indeed want to get some kind of constraining of costs, you're going to have to take over the hospitals. It's going to look more like VA for all. Free college tuition, all of them are talking about that. Guaranteed basic income, or there's a new phrase that they're starting to come up with, federal jobs guarantee, same thing. Abolishing ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, living wage of $15 an hour. And if you don't think this is a big issue, you can go out on YouTube right now, and there was a candidate forum the other day in which you had a number of Democratic candidates, and they asked some questions. You know, most of you are for abolishing ICE. Are there any of you that would support ICE, that is Immigration and Customs Enforcement? This one poor woman candidate raises her hand, and she just booed down. A little bit later, they asked another question. She raised her hand. I don't think she wanted to raise her hand again, because everybody in the audience was taking the most radical views. And so as a result, kind of the new leaders in some respects in the Democratic Party right now have become Bernie Sanders, and particularly kind of the new young face is this 28-year-old Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. This is not serving them well, by the way, because I might point out that not only has she been able to get lots of media attention, but a lot of that media attention shows that she doesn't know a great deal in some cases about history, about politics, about economics. She's full of passion. She's got progressive talking points, but she's oftentimes pretty short on facts and historical perspective. Again, she's 28 years of age. You might say, well, where were you when you were 28 years of age? Well, I was a little more humble about what I needed to learn. I went back to a get a second master's degree at Georgetown University to learn a few things about government, but she's convinced she knows it all. And so it begins to be a little bit more difficult for her when all of a sudden people start asking her some questions. For example, she was on the PBS program Firing Line, and that might sound familiar to some of us a little bit older. That was a program that was initiated by William F. Buckley, and the kind of rebranding of this now has come out. And you got Margaret Hoover on that program, and she was asking Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, you know, for example, what her positions were, and she gave very dogmatic answers about politics and economics and capitalism and education. But the clip that a lot of people have been looking at is one where she referred to Israel's occupation of Palestine, which caused Margaret Hoover to kind of question her a little bit more about that and try to explain it. And if you've ever watched the clip, you see kind of this cringe-worthy attempt to try to sort of backtrack, and finally ends with her conclusion and admission that she's not the expert on geopolitics on this issue. You think? Well, then when you get into some of the other issues, the economy, you know, she has a theory. The reason the unemployment is so low, she says, is because everyone has two jobs. Now, I'll give her credit because she's not the only individual out there on giving that progressive answer. You might have seen Elizabeth Warren just the other day said, well, the reason we have problems in the economy is because some people have 2, 3, 4 jobs just to make ends meet. The only problem with that is that is not accurate at all. It's not even close. The left-leaning PolitiFact actually rated the claim not just as false, but as pants on fire false. And so, again, you're seeing her taking all sorts of positions. But what's so interesting is as she is gaining more and more attention, and as Bernie Sanders has had this attention for some time, you can look at her website, for example, and see that she's for free college. She's for the federal jobs guarantee, single-payer health care. We just talked about that a minute ago. I love this one. Housing as a human right, which means everybody has to be guaranteed housing, and mobilizing against climate change. She's also for gun control and, of course, as you might imagine, abolishing ICE, immigration and customs enforcement. So my argument is that this is going to be a more interesting campaign, and it is intriguing to see that already some of the individuals in the Democratic Party who are saying some of the things we've said around the table, if you're doubling down on a lot of these very left-leaning progressive ideas, it may really cause a fair number of people in the electorate to go the other direction. And, of course, when they are asked to try to explain how you're going to pay for that, you get a lot of hand-waving, a lot of claims that we're going to raise the tax rates on individuals. And yet, of course, as we've pointed out on this program many times before, just because I raise the tax rate on individuals doesn't mean they're going to pay the taxes. They might just say, you know, I'm just going to close down that business. I'm just not going to invest in that. I'll just sit on my capital, and we won't create more jobs, and you won't have more income. But nevertheless, that's kind of one of those interesting phenomenon that is unfolded, and I thought you'd be interested in that. It's the first article on our website, pointofview.net. When we come back, I want to talk about online mobbing, and then we're going to be talking a little bit later with Robert Knight. All that coming up right after this.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net. Or call 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Privileged to have with us now Robert Knight, and again, an individual that we use so often and posted a number of his commentaries. Matter of fact, today we've posted a couple. Living in Revolutionary Times, Tired of Winning Yet, which talks about some of the successes, and is one that came out today, The Predictability of Barack Obama. But I might also mention some of the other things we want to get into. A couple of really good booklets that are available through D. James Kennedy's ministry and probably also on Robert Knight's website as well. called Confronting Lies and Hate, which dealt a lot with the issue of hate crimes and things of that nature. And this new one that just come across my desk, Strong Constitution, What Would America Look Like If We Followed the Law, which is a little similar to my commentary today on what I think an originalist court might look like. So lots to cover. Robert Knight, always fun to have you on the program with us.
Hey, always good to be on with you, Kerby.
Living in Revolutionary Times. I thought we might start there because that was a piece that is kind of taking us back to something we've talked about in the month of July. Oftentimes before the 4th of July, I talk about the Declaration of Independence, talk about the American Revolution. More recently, we had Jay Cost on talking about Hamilton and Madison. But here you kind of paint a different picture and a reminder that we did have an American Revolution and a French Revolution. The American Revolution has given us freedom, but the French Revolution has given us tyranny and really spawned all sorts of other tyranny around the world, hasn't it? Guess I lost him. We'll see if we can get Robert Knight back in just a minute, and we'll see what we can do to deal with that particular issue. But again, those are some articles that we have posted on the website today. And if you would like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We're talking today about living in revolutionary times. And he said, over the weekend, in addition to being on the World Cup soccer final against tiny Croatia, France got to celebrate Bastille Day, which is to commemorate the storming of the infamous Paris prison. And if nothing else, it's fair to say he says that the soccer match was worthy of featuring. But I think now I have Robert Knight back. So thank you for joining us once again here on Point of View.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry about that. I got a call from my son, and somehow it overrode this call. So, but I'm back.
Well, that's good. So let's talk about the French Revolution for a minute, because I think a lot of people, if they haven't really looked at history, think, well, those are two revolutions. Well, they're as different as night and day, aren't they?
Oh, they are. The American Revolution was to restore the rights of Englishmen, which were created by God, as the great English jurist Blackstone propounded in his laws. This is English common law is founded on biblical law. So the colonists said, well, gee, King George isn't acting like a Christian, and he's depriving us of all sorts of liberties, and we're not going to take it anymore. And by the way, we don't think anybody's worthy of ruling us because we know human nature is flawed, but we do think human life is sacred because we read the Bible and we know what God thinks of it. So they devised a system where the government protects life, but no man or men can get too much power. So they had separation of powers. They divided the segments of government, and they have checks and balances even within the segments. And the French Revolution, on the other hand, was an overthrow of the moral order. They brought a goat into the Cathedral of Notre Dame, or Notre Dame, and crowned it the goddess of reason, and killed priests and started cutting off people's heads. And the whole idea was that we must destroy the past, all of it, especially the Christian past, and then create the new socialist man on the ashes of our old civilization. And we're going to do it without God because we don't believe in God. And what happened was they started killing people right and left. They started killing even their own who weren't sufficiently revolutionary. The regime collapsed, and it led to the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, who plunged all of Europe into war shortly afterwards. But it went beyond that, Kerby. French Revolution was the seminal point for socialism. The socialist ideologies came out in the 19th century, most prominently Karl Marx, writing the Communist Manifesto with Frederick Engels, but many other socialist philosophers, all of whom were atheists. And that led directly to Nazism, the new National Socialist Workers' Party in Germany. And they quarreled with the communists because the communists had arisen in Russia, but some of them in Germany. But the whole thing was a quarrel on the left because it was a revolt against God, God's moral order, And it's totally different from what the American Revolution resulted in, which was the greatest amount of freedom and prosperity the world has ever seen.
And again, when we talk about the American Revolution, it wasn't a radical revolution. If nothing else, it was to sort of call back to an understanding of human nature. And it wasn't as radical as some people might have assumed it to be. Whereas the French Revolution was the idea that we're going to overthrow all the moral order, and we're going to assume that by changing the culture around them and the political and economic substrate and foundations, we'll create a new man. So one was based upon kind of a Christian view of human sinfulness and the fact that human nature is pretty much fixed. The other was based upon this sort of idea that a utopian change can bring about the new man and a utopia, and it's turned out to be anything but a utopia, hasn't it?
Well, yeah, and it's happening today. If you look in Venezuela, which was a prosperous country, they're sitting on the world's largest oil reserves, and yet they're in deep poverty. They're having food riots. They're even invading the city zoos to eat the zoo animals. They don't have toilet paper. I mean, the socialist regime there has destroyed the country. Hundreds of thousands of people have fled into Colombia. And yet, if you ask a progressive in America, they'll say, well, they just haven't tried socialism in quite the right way yet. And they didn't quite try it right in North Korea, and they didn't quite get it right in Cuba. And they did. I mean, you could go on. And China, for instance, where civil rights are just non-existent and Christians are being persecuted. They may be a largely capitalist society at this point, but they're living according to the rules of communism. And communism is hostile to Christianity because communism has its own God, and that's the human face in the mirror, not the God above.
And one of the other things I thought I might just mention before we move on, and again, we've posted this column, is you quote from Steven Pinker, Harvard professor. And I've talked about his book and have made my way through some of it, Enlightenment Now. And the argument of Steven Pinker is, well, the Enlightenment is working. In other words, all the various benefits that we are enjoying now comes from the Enlightenment. And even Jonah Goldberg's book kind of gets into that as well. And I just go back and say, no, I actually think that the beneficiaries today go all the way back to the ideas of Christianity, that the rise of modern science, the rise of this idea that individuals have rights which are endowed by their Creator and other things, those don't come from the Enlightenment. Those really come from Christian ideas, don't they?
Well, they do. There was a book a few years ago called The Savior of Science, and it lays out where science developed in various cultures. And it looks at Islam, it looks at China, the Hindu culture in India, and it concludes that everywhere but the West, science began but then stalled because it wasn't supported by the worldview that Christianity brings, which is that we have a loving God who loves us enough to give us brains to explore and discover his marvelous design of the universe, and that that there are fixed laws that we can discover and use to our advantage. And by the way, there's several kinds, not just the physical laws, but there's natural law for human interactions and the moral law. And that's God's explicit guidance for how we should conduct our lives. You see that only in the West. You see the rise of individual liberty only in the West and in places touched by the Christian West. So this idea that all cultures are equal and it just sort of evolved, which is something Barack Obama said the other day. I referenced it in my latest column. He was talking about how we got through World War II, and then we saw that totalitarianism was bad, but then he doesn't credit the West with winning it. It just sort of happened, and we don't want to. And the fall of the Soviet Union, well, we don't want to mention Ronald Reagan, Pope John Paul II, and Margaret Thatcher. That would be giving too much credit to his political enemies.
Yeah. Let's take a break, but I might just mention we have not posted this one, although maybe I'll do it tomorrow, the new column by Robert Knight called The Predictability of Barack Obama. He was speaking in South Africa, and to kind of give you the punchline, there are times when he sounded like Ronald Reagan, but then one of the things I appreciate about Robert Knight doing is a few places where he kind of translates into what was being said, and in a few cases gives a corrective to what was being said. So that is a piece that just came out today. When we come back, I do want to at least spend a little bit of time talking about your piece, Are You Tired of Winning? Because it has been a time of significant success, and it's worth mentioning, and you do so in that column as well. We'll come back and also talk about his new booklets, Strong Constitution and Confronting Lies and Hate. All that coming up right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Whether it's Tim Tebow, Coach Joe Kennedy, or the thousands of players taking a knee together in prayer after a game, prayer seems to be a popular theme around football. At Wrights High School in Evansville, Indiana, the players value prayer rather highly, it would seem. That became controversial only when a picture of the players gathered in prayer landed on the front page of the local newspaper. Activists sent the school district an angry letter threatening a lawsuit should the school officials refuse to take action. According to them, the coach was violating the law because the picture showed him surrounded by his football players and everyone appeared to be praying. But let's break down that picture a little closer. Yes, the coach was in the center, surrounded by his players, but it clearly shows the players with bowed heads and hands laid on the coach, led by one player whose lips are forming the prayers. The players were praying for their coach. Activists would have this coach stop up his ears and run screaming from the scene of this religious activity, but common sense and the Constitution would call this hostility to the free exercise of religion by the players. Students have a First Amendment right to pray for their coach, and the school cannot legally stop their religious expression. Thankfully, that's precisely what school officials told the activists. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Students and teachers are being told that prayer, Bibles, and religion are illegal in public school, but that's not true. Learn the facts. Read your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org right now. Don't let anyone steal your freedom with bad information. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Robert Knight with us for a few more minutes. Again, a weekly columnist for the Washington Times, Town Hall, One News Now, Barbed Wire, and a variety of others. An individual that has worked with so many different ministries and organizations over the years, and, of course, even has served as an editor and writer at the Los Angeles Times. Before we get into your other column, let's just mention that some of these booklets available through D. James Kennedy are things you've written, about 60 pages on confronting lies and hate, responding with truth and grace. And the newest one, A Strong Constitution. What would America look like if we followed the law, which gets into issues about restoring respect for life, the whole issue of federalism, civil rights, economic liberty, and a variety of other issues. And so, Robert Knight, those are available through D. James Kennedy's ministry. And again, it's just a great resource that you've made available over the years with all of your writing.
And I've got a new book coming out. I think it'll be out in September. It's going to be called A Nation Worth Fighting For, 10 Steps to Restore Freedom. And it's things people can actually do, but it also traces how we lost freedom in many areas and how we can get it back. But I think the most interesting part of that America, A Strong Constitution book is the explanation for how we got from Griswold versus Connecticut in 1965, which was a contraceptive case, all the way up to gay marriage in 2015.
Yes.
And it's because the court hijacked this sanctity of marriage and applied it to other things. They said in Griswold versus Connecticut, you can't have a law restricting sale of contraceptives to married couples because marriage is sacred. Whatever the couple do is their business. Okay, good enough. But then they applied it to unmarried couples. So they could have used different reasoning, but instead they grabbed the sanctity of marriage and they created the right of privacy. And that's you've heard that term applied to the abortion cases. And that's exactly what happened. They took the sanctity of marriage, turned it into a right of privacy, and then just started going through the law, applying it elsewhere. It was a bait and switch.
Yeah,
and it finally went all the way up to the Obergefell decision in 2015, where they decided that marriage in and of itself was no longer so sacred that it had to be a man and a woman. We're going to redefine it using the very same logic we have developed over the last several decades.
And again, Chapter 2 talks about that Griswold case all the way up to Chapter 4, which is the road back to natural marriage. So just some great material and always available to individuals that want to go to D. James Kennedy Ministries. And, of course, I can go to your website as well. But I thought before we run out, one of the other articles we posted and mentioned, but I thought it's always good to hear from the author himself, is one that came out earlier this month. And I love the title, and that is, Are You Tired of Winning Yet? And it has to do with the fact that Donald Trump, at that time, candidate Trump, said, you're eventually going to be winning so often you're going to get tired of winning. And you say, I'm not tired yet. But it has to do with the remarkable number of cases that came down. And Robert, if you and I 6 months ago had tried to predict how these various cases on the Masterpiece Cake case would go, how the case with pregnancy resource centers in California would go, how the one, for example, dealing with mandatory union dues and things of that nature would go, and a variety of others, I'm not sure we would have picked that all of those would be victories for religious liberty and for free speech, but that's exactly what we have.
It started on June 4th when the court held up the right of Jack Phillips and Masterpiece Cake Shop versus Colorado Civil Rights Commission not to be forced to facilitate a same-sex wedding. And the press has gotten that all wrong, Kerby, because they keep saying, well, they ruled that Christian business people don't have to do business with gay people. But that's not what they ruled at all. And Jack Phillips would be the first to tell you that. He'd say, no, I have gay customers. That's not the issue. The issue was the event. The event was a same-sex ceremony mimicking marriage that violates my biblical belief in God's institution of marriage. So I couldn't do that. You want to buy some cupcakes? You want to buy cookies? Anything else? And the press didn't make that distinction. But we read also that this was such a narrow decision. It centered on Justice Anthony Kennedy's being annoyed at the Civil Rights Commission for being openly anti-Christian. So they said, well, this shows animus of a religious nature, so it violates the First Amendment. But it's not as narrow as they thought, because the next case was Baronelle Stutzman, and I'm sure you've discussed her case on air many times. Washington State, she's a florist. Two dear gay friends of hers wanted her to do flowers for their wedding. She said, well, I can give you anything else, but I can't do the wedding. Same reason with Jack Phillips. So the court vacated the ruling, sent it back to the Washington Supreme Court. And that was based directly on the Masterpiece Cake Shop case. You mentioned a couple others. I mean, this was like all the way through June, Kerby, right from June 4th right up until the end of the term, case after case came down, I believe, on the right side of things. Ohio could remove voters from the registration rolls because they didn't return registration packages, and they were trying to clean up the voter rolls. And the court said, yeah, you can clean up the voter rolls. In Trump versus Hawaii, they struck down these judges who said, we, not the President of the United States, are going to determine who comes in the country. And President Trump had a travel ban on several countries that are terror-prone. And these judges just kept striking it down. The court said, you can't do that. You don't have that authority. And you mentioned the crisis pregnancy law. That was in California. They ordered crisis pregnancy centers to advertise for abortions. And they said, you can't force someone to advertise a viewpoint they don't agree with. And finally, the public employee unions. A lot of people who are public employees don't want to belong to these unions, and they're forced to pay dues that the unions then use to send to progressive candidates who then lobby for higher benefits and that sort of thing. And that's a violation of free speech. It's a violation of the people's right not to be forced to fund opinions with which they disagree. So all these cases were amazing victories. So that's why I said, are you tired of winning yet? No, we can use some more, but this is a good start.
Well, and again, you already have Neil Gorsuch on the court, and I suspect that Brett Kavanaugh will be in there. And again, I know you're not a lawyer, but you've been a senior fellow in the past for the American Civil Rights Union, and you've been with the Heritage Foundation and Family Research Council. But I would think that bodes well for many of these other cases of compelled speech and religious liberty, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. And this is why the left is in a panic, trying to figure out a way to keep Brett Kavanaugh off the court. This devolves so well to the conservatives, because if they somehow manage to keep this, good and sound justice off the court, then they face the voters in November, and they have to explain why you would do such a thing. On the other hand, if he gets seated, then you have Trump saying, look, we now have a truly conservative court. And we can start undoing some of the other bad decisions over the years. And the left is apoplectic because they think this will lead to the overthrow of the Roe v. Wade decision from 1973. And it may well lead, at least in an incremental way, toward overturning that, because it's very bad constitutional law.
Well, again, Robert Knight is somebody we always enjoy hearing from, and we've posted a couple of his articles on Living in Revolutionary Times, Tired of Winning Yet? And we'll see if we can post in the next day or two Predictability of Barack Obama, a very good piece as well. And I might just point you to his booklets, Strong Constitution, Confronting Lies and Hate. And Robert, always great to have you on the program. Look forward to the next opportunity.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on, Kerby. I always enjoy being on Point of View.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, Mary DeMuth will be in studio with us. We're going to spend some time talking about sexual abuse, culpability, and certainly welcome your phone calls. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me this hour. We're going to be talking about a very difficult topic. It is sexual abuse and really the whole issue of culpability and responsibility. Those are a couple of topics that we will put on the table. We will be, of course, talking about a difficult issue. And if you have children listening, be aware of that. But I think we'll try to be as careful as we can. And this is a topic we've come back to from time to time, in part because it's important for us in the church to speak to this issue. Also, it's important because of the culture with the Me Too movement. And if you go and look at our latest issue of Outlook magazine, there's information about that. And we've, of course, depended upon a couple of experts to really help us understand what is taking place. And we have in studio, as I've been advertising, Mary DeMuth, who is not only the author of more than 30 books, but also has really been at the forefront of addressing this. First from her own personal experience and then from kind of the ongoing ministry that she has. So, Mary, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Two issues, and I'm going to look at the second one more than the first. But, you know, when a lot of these stories broke, there was people saying, well, why didn't the victims speak out? And we understand sometimes that victims didn't speak out because they just want to put them behind them or they didn't know that they would be believed. I remember decades ago, there was a person in our ministry that said, well, when I shared it with a pastor, he said, oh, that can't possibly be the case. Well, you're not going to share anything again on that one. And so we can leave that one aside because the one we want to focus on today is what happens when they speak out and nobody does anything. And that, of course, is your own experience, isn't it?
It is. And I think that's why we tend to accuse victims because they do often speak out. And in my particular story at 5 years old, I told my babysitter what was going on with me. And she didn't remedy the situation. She just kept allowing those boys to continue their attacks. And so in my mind, I thought, well, it doesn't matter if I tell anybody. And it took me another decade before I finally talked about it again. And again, I was only 5, but, you know, I did tell and it didn't matter. And so I think that is one of the things that we're running into in the world and also in the church, that we just don't want to believe we live in a dark world. And so if we hear an allegation, our tendency is to not want to believe it. And I get that. I don't want to believe it either. I don't want to know that upstanding person is doing those awful things. I would rather that not be the world I live in. But the truth is sometimes there are folks out there that do that.
Well, and one of the reasons I wanted to bring this up is because I saw your blog post. I read you quite regularly, of course. And,
thanks, Kerby. You're the best.
MaryDeMuth.com. And we have posted that piece. And it all has to do with this film called Paterno, which apparently is really powerful. I have not had a chance to see it, although I've seen the trailer and I've seen your analysis of it. And anybody that knows anything about Coach Joe Paterno, before we knew all these allegations, he was one of the most beloved individuals, you know, the coach of the Nittany Lions. Any of our listeners in Pennsylvania know exactly what I'm talking about. You just cannot go to that town without just a tremendous amount of respect that he had. And then the allegations broke out, and it turns out that he knew quite a bit. Well, near the end of the film, I guess, spoiler alert, we find out he knew a lot earlier than we thought. And here is a perfect example of an individual who knew and did nothing. Tell us more.
Yeah, so my husband and I watched that a couple weeks ago, and it did really surprise me. One thing I appreciate about the film, and again, it's a documentary-ish, not really a documentary, it's a film, so it's not, you're not seeing actual footage, but I felt like it did a really good job of giving you empathy for Joe. Like it was agonizing. The whole thing was completely agonizing. But that last scene of the movie was a phone call that the reporter who won the Pulitzer for it, she received from someone. They said, hey, this happened to me too. And I was one of Sandusky's victims. And she said, oh yeah, a lot of you are calling me. So, what went on. And he said, well, I know that Joe knew. And she goes, oh, was that like in 2004 or whatever? Because those were the times where that's when he thought he knew. And it was in the 70s. And that was just the end of the movie.
That gets your attention.
Thankfully, I've got like fact checker husband. And so he looked into that, and there is some dispute on whether that really happened or not, but it's generally believed to be true. And you and I spoke off air about just some of the signs that would have been there anyway, if he didn't know with words or by someone coming to him. There were enough things going on in Sandusky's life that there were some pretty big blaring red flags.
And that's part of what I want to talk about. First of all, if nothing else, I hope this is a public service to all of the positions and people in positions, probably a better way to say it, who recognize that they have a responsibility. So we're talking about teachers who might be listening right now because they're not in school. We're talking about pastors and youth leaders and others. You have a duty and a very important duty to actually report. And part of that duty comes from maybe not necessarily having all the signs, but seeing enough to begin to know that I need to get involved, right?
Right. We have a duty to report in particularly those helping professions, and it varies from state to state as to who those are. But if you have a credible if you believe credibly that something is happening, it's best for you not to do the investigation.
Right.
And churches run into this all the time. They're like, well, we'll keep this in-house. We'll investigate this. But they can't. They're not equipped to do a criminal investigation like that. So the best thing that you can do is to report it to the authorities who actually know how to do this. That's their thing. They know how to investigate.
And we've seen at least two examples, one in the public schools where we have a problem. And so they say, I don't want a lawsuit, so I'll just fire the guy, but I won't tell the next school district. So
Right.
we perpetuate that. And of course, hey, let's talk about what happened in the church. Whether it's the Catholic Church, I know of good examples in Protestant churches too, where they just let the person go, but they don't think through the implications of if this person has done that in this church, they're going to do it in another church as well. And if they've done it in this public school, they're going to do it in another public school.
Yeah, we just had a story break last week of a woman who had been sexually assaulted by a student at Southwestern, and it hit the newspapers, and now she has pressed charges. But he was censured by the IMB, but he kept continuing to be able to go all around the country and the world as a missionary to do ministry. And I think that's the stressful thing about the Protestant churches, at least in the Catholic Church. It was bad, and they shifted people around from place to place, but there were records of it. In the Protestant church, we don't tend to work together, and we don't have necessarily this way where our institutions are connecting with one another and talking to one another.
Well, again, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, let me open up the phones, because all the way through this, we want to talk about this issue of sexual abuse, sexual harassment, culpability, the tendency sometimes to know something and to do nothing. And, of course, we don't want to turn, Joe Paterno into our whipping boy, but at the same time, we want to use that as an illustration. And if you'd like to read this, first of all, this is a good actual post that's a blog post by Mary DeMuth. It also has a link to the trailer in case you wanted to watch it yourself, but also it's just something you might want to pass on. If you're in a position of leadership, you need to know this. If you can think of somebody that's in a position of leadership that you know, we have created it in such a way that you could pass it on to them and get them thinking about this so that they don't perpetuate this kind of sexual sin that is taking place. But if you'd like to join us, let's also open up the phones. 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to remain anonymous, you can do so. Mary DeMuth in studio. We have a lot more to cover, and we'll do that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
There's been lots of fear-mongering from the left about how the newly constituted Supreme Court would rule on various social issues. Justices that attempt to apply the original intent of the Constitution to legal issues are called originalist. Here are a few suggestions about how an originalist court might rule on cases before it. Abortion. Despite the fears being spread that the next court would overturn Roe v. Wade, there isn't any likelihood that it would happen soon. First, there has to be a significant case that would come before the court. Then there would have to be at least 5 justices willing to use the case to overturn the 1973 abortion decision that has been a precedent for over 4 decades. Religious liberty. The narrow decision in the Masterpiece Cake Shop case suggests that future religious liberty cases will be decided in favor of the First Amendment, even when it appears to conflict with LGBT issues. In fact, the Kennedy opinion in the case suggests that further confirmation of religious liberty will come when future cases come before the court. Gun laws. An originalist court would probably provide clearer definition for the Second Amendment rights of citizens. The court has already ruled in 2 cases about the right to own weapons that are in common use for lawful purposes. And affirmative action. An originalist court would probably be a colorblind court. The original meaning of equal protection in the Constitution would suggest that attempts to favor one race over another would be unconstitutional. These few examples conform to what most Americans would desire from the Supreme Court. In fact, they match up closely to various opinion polls taken over the last few decades. An originalist court would not be as controversial as many liberals say that it would be. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Pleased to have in the studio with us today Mary DeMuth, and if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. A little bit later, I want to talk about some of your upcoming books, author of more than 30 books, and some really excellent resources that you also can get by going to marydemuth.com. But let's stay on this topic for a little bit longer, because I know some of our listeners might want to join the conversation, and we certainly do welcome their comments and questions as well. But what have you found as you have been working in this area? As soon as you sort of poke your head up, all of a sudden everybody shares stories, but also, and you're hearing these stories, how prevalent do you think it is? It's hard to get an estimate, but even from an anecdotal point of view of other individuals that say, I reported it and people didn't do anything.
Yeah, so there was a case just this week. I think the link came up actually last week on Inside Higher Ed about a professor at Taylor University who has been, who's no longer there. And he also was teaching writing, so he's a writing professor, and made all the conference circuits of writing conferences, Christian writers conferences. And there have been so many allegations over the years of people that actually did report many different times in many different ways over decades.
Wow.
And yet nothing happened until just recently. And it's really hard for me to wrap my mind around it, that so many people were culpable in the midst of that. There's probably, I'm guessing, but maybe at least a half a dozen to a dozen people who heard the information and did not act on it.
Yes. And the sad reality is that I would hope on any one of these social issues, and we've talked about lots of them, that Christians would be on the forefront. And occasionally we have been, but this is one case where it really, I think, sort of took the Me Too movement, the hashtag Me Too movement, to get everybody's attention. Now, you and I have been talking about this for some time, and we had Noel Boucher here last time you were here. So let's give credit where credit is due. Linda Smith, we can talk about a number of individuals that have, but by and large, this is something that's really come to the forefront more because the world has said this is an issue. And this is something the church should have been on the forefront since the very beginning, don't you think?
I agree. And I've talked about my friend Boz Chavision, who is the grandson of Billy Graham. And he was a prosecutor and prosecuting these predators. And what he would do is he'd walk into the courtroom, and half the courtroom would be full of church congregants who were supporting the perpetrator, and the other half would be empty. And so he started a ministry called netgrace.org, and they go in and help churches and ministries to understand what is the nature of abuse, how to report it, how to create a safe environment for your home and for your church and for your ministry. And there's a lot of people out there on the front lines, but he started because he saw this huge need, like, why is it that the church is preferring perpetrators over the victim? And why is there so much institutional protectionism going on in ministries in the church? And I understand why. I mean, we don't want our dirty laundry to be aired, but in an era now where most people actually prefer authenticity, tempered, I think I would have rather heard a church say, hey, this person did this terrible thing. We feel awful about it. We missed it. We're sorry. We're going to cooperate with authorities. We're going to pay for any sort of counseling for the victims, and he won't ever, he or she won't ever work in ministry again, and we'll make sure of it. So like that to me is honest, and that is admitting that, something went wrong on your watch, which happens. I mean, this is a fallen world. Of course it's going to happen. But instead we're building these walls of protection because we think that people can't handle the actual truth when actually it's the other way around. We actually want the truth.
I might just mention that we have interviewed Boz Chavision on here, and if you can't spell the last name, and I can't either.
I can't either.
B-O-Z probably will get you there, but if not, we can get that to you as well. And that illustrates another point, Mary, and that is there are some things that churches can do preemptively. We don't always have to react after the fact. Right. And, for example, I sit on one board that actually has a Christian school. By sitting on the board, not only does every teacher have to go through a background check, but even as a board member, I had to go through a background check. Did I think that was a bad idea? No, I thought that was a really good idea, right? And again, we have a lot of vacation Bible schools and things like that. Do you have some suggestions on what we might do before we take some phone calls?
Yeah, definitely do those background checks, absolutely. But also do a check on past employment because sometimes people slip through, like there may have been an allegation, but it was never taken to law enforcement. And it's important to kind of trace back the entire history. I know that takes time, but if it means protecting the children within your care that you're called to shepherd, then it's worth that extra effort.
Let's take some phone calls. Again, you can remain anonymous, and or otherwise, I'll just use your name on the air. And we'll go to Nevada KYCC, Siobhan, and I think you want to share your testimony, so you have the floor.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Lord, for letting me be on here. I have a story about child abuse, and I'll try to make it short. I was sexually abused as a child, but not all the way, just a little bit of, it was more, my uncle was crushing me all the time, but I was bruised. Anyways, so that all happened to me as a kid, and I was told I would be killed if I told, and there's people all over the world that will kill you if you say anything. So it was very hard for me to grow up. And my grandmother was raising me because my mother died, and I was only 3 when she died, and I was very upset. So then all that happened as a kid. When I grew up, when I heard about homeschooling, and this uncle that did that to me also worked at my elementary school, so I was very nervous at school. Then I had 2 little daughters, and all I wanted was that to happen to them. So eventually I ended up moving to Texas with my husband. He was gone a lot on the oil industry, and my youngest daughter was in Awana class, and the man who was teaching Awana, he had 5 daughters, and he was sexually abusing my daughter when I dropped her off at Awana. It was the only time I got away from my daughter to go have a little time by myself, and it was the safest place I could take her. I thought, because my husband traveled, and I just wanted a little time to myself. I never got to be away from my daughters.
And we expect that when we go to church, or you go to a Awana program, or you go to a Boy Scout event, or a Girl Scout event, that would be safe. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, it was the only place, and they were homeschooled because a friend of mine told me, since your husband travels, it might be good to homeschool them so they could see their father when he was home, and we could do our field trips then. So I was very protective of my daughters because of my childhood. And then here in Awana, this was happening to my youngest daughter, and this was in Cypress, Texas. Yeah. So what happened was my younger daughter would...
I just wanted to ask you real quickly, did you report that? Or did you only find out later?
She didn't tell me.
Yeah,
she never told me.
Yeah, I was afraid of that. Yeah,
her behavior was awful as a child. She fought with me all the time. She didn't want to go to Awana anymore, so I said, fine, I won't take you there. She wouldn't go to Sunday school because that man was in there, so I brought her into the church service. Something was wrong, but I didn't know what it was. I thought it was her clingy personality because it was just my daughters and I all the time. I thought maybe she was just very clingy, and she was also kind of hyperactive, so that just made her worse. So she was very hard to deal with. She didn't sleep all night. She talked all night. It ruined her whole childhood, and I never knew. And then my husband died, and then I got remarried to a Christian man, and I moved all the way to California where I grew up. And then she told me then when she was about 20 years old, and if only I had known,
Sure.
I would have gone after that man. I would hold on that man or something. But now my daughter had never she doesn't like me. She fights against me a lot. She's a young adult. They were homeschooled. They were so precious. And then I put them in a Christian school when their daddy died to try to protect them. And that wasn't the best thing either because some of those kids in there are being reformed. So anyways, that daughter and I don't speak much. We're very injured. We have a big wedge between us since she was a little tiny girl since that happened. I don't know how to fix it. I can't afford counseling. I can't afford, to have her counseled, and it's way too late. She didn't tell me till she was older. So every day I'm very distressed over it, and my whole life. And once she told me, I've been very distressed. And my second husband just died a year ago, and he was a Christian. So now I'm a widow twice. I have all that to work with, have to deal with and heal, and then trying to heal between my daughter and I even moved to her city where she lives now to try to reconcile, and she still won't hardly talk to me. And I know it's from that very root cause.
Yes. Well, let me jump in real quickly because we have to take a mandatory break. And when I come back, I want to hear from Mary just a little bit. But first of all, let me just encourage our listeners to pray for her and her daughter. And if nothing else, one of the things that Mary DeMuth does all the time is pray. And if you go to her website, you will see this is opportunity for her to pray for you. And I know that you will do so. So again, one of the things you can find at marydemuth.com is Pray Everyday Podcast. And she also says, do you have a need for prayer? And there's an opportunity for you to have her pray for you as well. And we'll also talk about what can happen and what a disaster. Just illustrates again the devastation first to the mother and then to the daughter. That brings it home. We'll take a break, continue our conversation right after this.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221, or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Mary DeMuth in studio with us. And we had one caller from Nevada wanted to share her story. I've got some others that want to call and encourage her and share their own story. But before we do so, Mary, first of all, we have a link to marydemuth.com, and that is a great resource, and we'll talk more about what's available there in just a minute. But Mary, what would you say to a mother who's been abused, whose daughter was abused, and just all the difficulties she's dealing with right now?
I do have a couple of resources for her. One is my memoir entitled Thin Places, which might be a really good place for you both to choose to read it and talk about it. And then also Not Marked, Finding Hope and Healing After Sexual Abuse, which helps people walk through the stages of healing if you've had that in your life. And the other thing I'd like to say is it doesn't do you any good by heaping the blame upon yourself. You did what you could do at that time, and it does warrant an apology, and it sounds like you have apologized to her. But there may be a time that comes that God creates, a moment he creates where you can just say, maybe I should have realized that your behavior change was a trigger and that something was going on. I missed it. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. And then as far as her not forgiving you, that's her journey. She has got to come to the place where she works through that and chooses to forgive, even though you didn't try to hurt her, but she still has to work on that on her side. And you can't force that reconciliation. And that's where prayer comes in. Just keep praying. We pray for you, and we hope and pray that the Lord will bring that reconciliation. It sounds like your heart is tender before him. And because of that, I just believe that God, in his perfect timing, will bring about a really good conversation that you can have. And it's normal also, just to let you know, it's really normal for her to be angry. A lot of times sexual abuse victims will work through their trauma of the sexual abuse, and then they have to work through the trauma of not being believed or not being protected. And so that is actually a really hard thing to get over. And I had almost a harder time walking through that aspect of my sexual abuse, of not being protected as a little girl, than the actual event itself. So just to let you know, what she's doing and how she's acting is completely normal. And she's just on a healing journey as well.
Yes. Again, you can see the kind of theological questions you ask. If God is all-powerful, why couldn't he have protected me? Why did this have to happen? But again, let's talk about some of the resources. If you go to marydemuth.com at the store, I'm going to mention 3 books. You mentioned 2. I'm going to mention, obviously, Thin Places, which is very good, and Not Marked. But another one that I thought was very well written, The Wall Around Your Heart, how Jesus heals the hurting. And so those are 3 out of 30 different books on Mary DeMuth's website that are available, and I would certainly recommend. Let's take another phone call, because I think this caller would like to maybe be an encouragement, but also share a testimony. So, Kathy in California, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
The good you do, and you do a lot of good. I try and listen to your program every chance I get, because I feel like I really get the truth about what's really going on, pretty much as best as a human being could do it.
Sure.
And the Lord leading you. It's really good. My heart went out to this lady who was talking about how she needed healing for her daughter and her. Because I've been attending Celebrate Recovery here in Stockton at this Quail Lakes Baptist Church, and
great church.
It's a very good church, very active in the community. Reach out, and it's at Tuesday nights at 6:15, and we reach out to the community and invite everybody, and it's helped me a lot because it goes through in our lives what we really need healing for, to really face things. And it helps in our relationship a lot. It's helped me in my relationship with the Lord and my relationship with other people, having a better understanding of what the Lord wants for us, and that's healing. And, sometimes things in life, God isn't going to go against our will. He's a perfect gentleman. Things just happen because our sin nature is so bad. We're capable of the worst sins because of our sin nature. But the Lord is all there and was with me in my experience, because I went through a sexual trauma too. It was more than a harassment. It was I was 22, getting ready to graduate from college, and a man broke into my apartment and sexually assaulted me. And the professors had said, if this ever happens, well, don't fight him because he could hurt you. He could put his hands around your neck. He could have a weapon. So I gave in, but he got caught. The police came, and they took him to jail for 2 weeks. And then I didn't see his face. So in the court of the hearing, I had to say, well, I didn't see his face. And in a way, I'm glad I didn't, because he was a perfect stranger who had been stalking me. But the Lord gave me the strength, even though I really didn't understand that much about the Lord then. I believed in God, but I didn't know that God was Jesus, and, that God is Jesus, and Jesus is God. And I didn't understand him, but she loved me. But he was there in that situation with me to protect me, to make it not be too much. So, but for a long time, I blamed myself. I blamed myself for the trauma. I thought, oh, this poor guy, and here I had suffered a lot, and I was angry.
Sure,
really angry.
Shame and guilt and grief and all sorts of things you go through.
Yeah, but the Lord gave me the strength to graduate, still graduate, take my finals, and because I was just getting ready to graduate from San Jose State College, well, it's a university now. And so, and through it, it's given me more compassion and more ability to counsel other people.
Very true.
And so when people have been through, I was 22, so my mind wasn't fully developed then. I mean, usually it's 25 for people, and some people a little before, a little after. But I still was hurt for a long, long time. I was angry at men. I was angry at God. But the Lord has forgiven me, and I figure with that forgiveness, I need to forgive him.
Well said.
And I have. And I pray for him, and it really works. Prayer really works. And that, his life is okay, because it must have been really hard for him. But I had to do it, because who knows how many people he hurt before or who he was going to hurt after.
Sure. Mary,
so
let me come to you and
get
get some of your comments, too, because I'd love to hear your thoughts. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's pretty common to feel the shame, and it's important that we place the shame on the person who perpetrates and not the one who has an apartment that's broken into. Like, you did not invite that to happen. There was nothing that you did to welcome that. So it's important that we kind of place that blame in the right place and not ourselves. But it's very common for a victim or a survivor, I guess is a better term, to think, well, what have I done to invite that in my life? And I do agree that forgiveness is absolutely important, but it is a long journey. And I want to caution listeners to be cautious and careful about their words in forced forgiveness. A lot of times we see this in churches where someone will come to a church and say, well, this person perpetrated, and you'll see the church put those two people in a room and then have the person apologize for the perpetration. And then they'll say, well, then you need to forgive in that moment. And it's a much longer journey than that. And you get to have that journey your way, and also understanding that you may initially choose to forgive, but there will be triggers that come and other things that happen to you in your life that will open up the wound, and you'll think, oh, well, I haven't forgiven. But actually, that's just another layer of forgiveness. You're constantly choosing to forgive. It's like, I chose to forgive. I choose to forgive again. I'm going to forgive again. And that keeps your heart light before the Lord. But yeah, it is a long journey, and you get to walk it in your way as God leads you, tenderly and gently.
And you said something else just in passing there about the way in which churches sometimes force forgiveness. Speak to the pastors for just a minute, because they really need to have some sensitivity when they look out in front of their congregation. If we take the typical statistics at heart, you are talking about, if you have a church of hundreds, you are talking about dozens and dozens of women that have been abused, and some men that have been as well. And so to never have addressed that issue is to done a disservice, I think, to the church, don't you think?
Well, and I think that's why we're experiencing a little bit of a revolving door of people leaving church. And I think we talked about this last time in our conversation. It's that I go to church and I suddenly think I'm a freak because I'm the only one that has this story. We really do need to get in the pulpit and talk about these real stories of domestic violence and sexual abuse, the things that we don't like to talk about, because then it helps people, it dignifies people's stories, and they believe they're no longer alone. So many people are suffering in the pews thinking, I'm the only one with this story, and that's just not the case.
Yes. Well, and again, one of those individuals that we're going to have on this coming month is an individual that's got a new book out, but I'm also going to ask him to talk a little bit about his abuse, because he said that on some of these various programs. And boy, I'll tell you, when you share that from the pulpit, all of a sudden there are some walls that come down, some openness that begins, some authenticity, and some vulnerability that takes place. So, pastors, pay attention to what we're talking about here today. When we come back, Mary DeMuth has got a couple more comments, and I also want to give you a preview of some of her upcoming books that I know will benefit you as well. All that coming up right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Whether it's Tim Tebow, Coach Joe Kennedy, or the thousands of players taking a knee together in prayer after a game, prayer seems to be a popular theme around football. At Wrights High School in Evansville, Indiana, the players value prayer rather highly, it would seem. That became controversial only when a picture of the players gathered in prayer landed on the front page of the local newspaper. Activists sent the school district an angry letter threatening a lawsuit should the school officials refuse to take action. According to them, the coach was violating the law because the picture showed him surrounded by his football players and everyone appeared to be praying. But let's break down that picture a little closer. Yes, the coach was in the center, surrounded by his players, but it clearly shows the players with bowed heads and hands laid on the coach, led by one player whose lips are forming the prayers. The players were praying for their coach. Activists would have this coach stop up his ears and run screaming from the scene of this religious activity, but common sense and the Constitution would call this hostility to the free exercise of religion by the players. Students have a First Amendment right to pray for their coach, and the school cannot legally stop their religious expression. Thankfully, that's precisely what school officials told the activists. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Students and teachers are being told that prayer, Bibles, and religion are illegal in public school, but that's not true. Learn the facts. Read your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org right now. Don't let anyone steal your freedom with bad information. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We might be able to get another phone call, but let me again mention that one of the things we've posted on the website today is, in addition to the link to marydemuth.com, is her blog post, which says those who knew and did nothing, and also has the official trailer for Paterno. So this might be something to be a great conversation starter in your family and some other resources. But also, as you go to the website, there's a place for you to go to the store and find some of the books. There's a place for you to pray for individuals. But just before we talk about your upcoming new books, any other thoughts about what pastors, Sunday school leaders, youth leaders can or should do in the church to be more effective?
You know, this might sound a little radical, but simply sitting down with someone you know who is an abuse victim and just listening to their story and asking qualifying questions is probably the best thing that they can do to give a human face to what the trauma and the tragedy is. And most sexual abuse victims suffer from PTSD. It's really common. And there's a lot of things that if you're a pastor and you want to love people well, you need to understand what you're dealing with, and that it's not a one and done. It's not a quick recovery. It takes a lifetime, and that the church, through things like what we heard earlier with Celebration Recovery and some of those really great ministries and the counseling centers at churches, are absolutely necessary, support groups, things like that. The church can be an amazing place of healing. And honestly, I don't want to be a church basher. I love the church. I'm in love with the church. I am passionate about the church. And most of my healing has come because people in the church have stopped. They've listened to my story. They've empathized. They've prayed for me. They pointed me to resources, and it has been an entirely beautiful blessing that the church has been there for me. And so I speak as an encourager to say, just listen to stories and you will go far just by simply listening.
Well said. Again, very good set of resources and other things at marydemuth.com, speaking, store, and a number of others. But I do have to spend some time talking about your upcoming book, The 7 Deadly Friendships. And this one is, and I'll keep a couple of these here in case people want to see a peek inside. But what you do is you go to Proverbs 6 and look at the 7 deadly sins. And it's interesting because, you had a list of 8. Of course, Pope Gregory combined a few and all that kind of stuff. But nevertheless,
we got sloth thrown in there.
Yeah, and so you got all those. But nevertheless, this is, and I'll hold this up for people to see the little booklet here, 7 Deadly Friendships, How to Heal When Painful Relationships Eat Away at Your Joy. Tell us more, if you might.
Yeah. So, we talk about sin in isolation. A lot of times we think, oh, well, there's sin and then there's relationships, but almost all sin is connected to relationship. And for those listening today who are suffering from sexual abuse, you know this to be very true. You are affected by the way other people are sinning against you. And so what I was finding in my own life was I was raised in a home where I had one of the people was a predator and one was a narcissist. And I spent a lot of my life with an incomplete story. So in other words, I never got that love from those two people. So I spent my life looking for predatory narcissists to fill the gap in my heart. And it wasn't until I started healing and understanding God's love for me, his affection for me, his kindness toward me, that I began to heal. And that's when I stopped pursuing these kind of toxic friendships. And so this is kind of my story of how I've learned to heal, but also to identify to the readers, what is a narcissistic person? What is a predatory person? How do you know if you're entangled with a con man or a gossip or, all these, or a drama queen or king? How do you know that? And what are the traits of these folks? And so I tied it into Proverbs 6 and just to help people have some kind of framework or some bones to hang the skin on or the flesh on of some bewildering friendships where you're like, why am I keep getting friends with these kinds of people? So, it's a little bit autobiographical.
But also why they take advantage of you.
Right.
Haughty eyes would be a narcissistic friend, and a lying tongue are the unreliable friends. Of course, hands that kill the innocent would be the predatory friends. A heart that plots evil would be the con man or the woman. And then, of course, feet that race to do wrong, which would be the tempter friends. A false witness are the faker friends, and a person who sows discord would be the dramatic friends. I think all of us want to read this book, right? And it's a Harvest House book coming out when?
October 1st.
Yeah, so we're looking forward to that. You'll get to come back on here to talk about that. And so that is one of those. But talk about some of the others, because you also talk about some of those other individuals that dump on you, I guess is a nice way to say that as well. So,
yes.
So those are some resources that are available for people in that regard, right?
Yes. And I think it's important that we take an inventory of our relationships. And the thing that I've talked about before, and I think I've shared with you on this show before, is what wounds is what heals. And so if you've been wounded in negative community, and I would call sexual abuse a very negative community, the way back to healing is positive and good community. And it's frustrating that God has that as the requirement. but we need Jesus with skin on. We need to really experience healing through other Christians, other believers. The problem is as you mentioned, the wall around your heart, we create this wall around our hearts, and then we don't go into the very avenue that Jesus uses to heal us, which is other people. And so maybe that's you today. And if that's you, I just want to tell you, I empathize with you and I've been there, but to take that risk and find a safe person. And in the 7 Deadly Friendships, there's a list of what is a safe person. Find that safe person and ask them to simply pray for you, because that'll be a step toward healing.
And again, we've already talked about people that have been abused in one way or another, people that have been taken advantage of in one way or another, and friends take advantage of you too. And so as a result, don't necessarily blame God because of something that someone else has done. If I could just wave that as a magic wand away from people, I think there'd be a lot more people in the kingdom, because I run into so many individuals that say, well, I just can't believe that there's a good God because of this evil that's happened, or I can't believe in the church because this evil happened inside the church. And so there is a sense in which there are free moral agents that do sinful things. And as a result, we need to understand those 7 deadly friendships. So that's why you wrote the book.
It is. And just to set people free and to help them to choose better relationships that don't continually hurt them. Because what happens is if we keep pursuing these negative friendships or relationships, it just continues to cause us to hurt more and more and more and wall off our hearts. So this is my preemptive strike to help folks.
And again, as you go to marydemuth.com, you can find the store. You can find out your speaking, the blog, but also you still are offering to pray for our individuals that are listening, right?
Yes, and every single day at prayeveryday.show, I pray for you according to Scripture. And so I think right now we're going through the Sermon on the Mount. The next is the book of James. And I am super excited to be able to tie those prayers to Scripture specifically for you and what you're walking through.
And again, Pray Everyday Podcast. I think we're at Matthew 7 there, so there's a good way to follow it.
Yep.
And so that is the case. So Mary DeMuth, it is always great to have you in studio with us.
Thanks for having me. It's so much fun.
We are going to take a break, and when we come back tomorrow, we'll get into some other issues. Let me just mention that tomorrow we have David Dockery on, we have Ann Graham-Lotz on, and a few other individuals, so it's going to be a really packed one tomorrow. In between there, we want to talk about some of the issues in the news as well. So if you find yourself saying, okay, this came pretty quick, I would like to listen to this again, you can go to our website and download the podcast. Since Mary's in studio with us, of course, you can also go to our YouTube channel and watch it again. And can I, again, encourage you to take some of the material, maybe it's just the blog post, and take it and send it to someone. Maybe it's a pastor, maybe it's a Sunday school leader, maybe it's a teacher, somebody that needs to know this, because sometimes the tendency is to say, well, I'm sorry it happened, but I'm not going to do anything about it. And then you just perpetuate that, and that's something that we want you to take action on. And again, you have a duty to report, and we give you that information right here on the website, pointofview.net. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. Have a great day. We will see you back here tomorrow with David Dockery and Ann Graham-Lotz.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.